If you want to understand the heartbreak, resilience, and mythology that defines the Chicago Cubs, you have to go all the way back before Wrigley Field, before the curse, even before they were called the Cubs. The story begins in 1870 when the city of Chicago, a booming industrial center on the edge of the American frontier, formed its first professional baseball team, the Chicago White Stockings. This wasn't just a hobby or a civic pride project, it was a bold statement. Chicago wanted to be a baseball town, and for a brief moment it was, but fate had other plans. In October of 1871, just months into the team's inaugural season in the National Association, the Great Chicago Fire tore through the city, reducing thousands of buildings and the team's ballpark to ash. The White Stockings, left without a stadium, uniforms, or players, were forced to disband. Most teams would have folded for good, but not Chicago. Before I get to the rest of the video, I just want to talk about what I'll be going over in this. If you don't care, just go to this timestamp on screen. Anyway, most baseball teams can take an hour or two to go over the entire history of, and while you may be interested in learning more about various teams, you may not want to watch a 2-hour documentary about each one. In this first episode of the series, where I plan on making a video for all 30 MLB clubs, I'm going to talk about the full history of every team as briefly as I can. With that being said, let's get into the video. They came back in 1874, the franchise was reborn, and just 2 years later in 1876, they helped found the National League, which remains the oldest major league in baseball. That year they claimed the very first National League pennant behind pitcher Albert Spalding, who later became even more famous for the sporting goods empire that bears his name. The White Stockings weren't just successful, they were innovators. They traveled more, experimented with uniforms, and took the sport more seriously than most of their peers. But the real face of this early team wasn't Spalding, it was Adrian "Cap" Anson. Anson wasn't just a player, he was a force, a towering first baseman with a booming voice and the ego to match. Anson was the heart of the franchise for over 2 decades. He was the team's star hitter, their manager, and their identity. By the time he retired, he had recorded over 3,000 hits, and he was arguably the first player to do so, depending on how 19th century statistics are interpreted. But his legacy is haunted by a darker truth. Anson was one of the loudest and most influential voices in keeping baseball segregated. His refusal to take the field against black players in exhibition games pushed Major League Baseball towards the informal but effective color barrier that stood until 1947. So while he brought glory to Chicago on the field, he also helped close the sport's doors to countless others off of it. Still though, under Anson's leadership, the White Stockings, later known as the Colts and briefly the Orphans, were a dominant force throughout the 1880s. With pitchers like Larry Kikorin and John Clarkson, they won 6 National League pennants in that decade alone. Their style was aggressive, even arrogant, they slid hard, ran wild on the bases, and weren't above bending the rules. They were early baseball's original villains, and they relished in it. But time catches everyone. Anson's influence faded, and by the late 1890s, the team was directionless. They had no clear identity, no aging stars to rally around. Sports writers, noticing the roster full of young and inexperienced players, began referring to the club as the Cubs, a nickname that first appeared in print in 1902. By 1906, it was in widespread use, and by 1907, it had become the team's official moniker. And then something amazing happened. In the early 1900s, the Cubs stopped being a punchline and became a dynasty. Led by fiery player-manager Frank Chance, the Cubs built a roster that played fast, smart, and hard. At second base was the scrappy Johnny Evers, at shortstop the slick-fielding Joe Tinker, and together the trio formed one of the most famous infield combinations in baseball history, immortalized forever in the 1910 poem Baseball Sad Lexicon, which begins, "These are the saddest of possible words, Tinkers to Evers to Chance." Behind them on the mound stood one of the most unorthodox and devastating pitchers of his era, Mordecai Three-Finger Brown. A childhood farming accident had mangled his hand, but the injury gave him a freakishly effective grip on the baseball. His curveball dropped off the table, baffling hitters who had never seen anything like it. This group didn't just win, they dominated. In 1906, the Cubs posted a jaw-dropping 116-36 record, still the highest winning percentage in the World Series era at .763, but in classic Cubs fashion, the dream ended in heartbreak. They lost the World Series to their crosstown rivals, the Chicago White Sox, a light-hitting team named the Hitless Wonders. But the Cubs weren't finished. In 1907, they came back and steamrolled through the season, finishing with 107 wins and brushing aside the Detroit Tigers in a 5-game World Series, with 1 tie. They outpitched, outhit, and outthought their opponents. Brown in particular was electric. Then in 1908, they did it again. Another World Series, another victory over the Tigers, and for the second year in a row, they stood on top of the baseball world. Frank Chance, still only in his early 30s, had guided a team of tough, skilled, and deeply loyal players to back-to-back championships. What no one knew at the time, and what no Cubs fan dared even imagine, was they just witnessed the last championship the franchise would win for the next 108 years. The 1908 Cubs didn't just win a World Series, they unknowingly closed the book on an era of dominance and opened the first chapter of what would become one of the most painful and infamous droughts in sports history. By the the early 1910s, the Cubs were still a force, but the dynasty was starting to age. Frank Chance's health declined, Tinker, Evans, and Brown began to move on, and the team slowly lost its edge. They did make it back to the World Series in 1910, losing to the Philadelphia Athletics, and again in 1918, but then falling to Babe Ruth's Red Sox in a wartime shortened season. While the win slowed, a new chapter was quietly beginning at the corner of Clark and Addison. Built in 1914 for the Chicago Whales of the short-lived Federal League, Weeghman Park became the Cubs' new home in 1916. When the league folded, the Cubs moved in. Over time, the park took on a character of its own. By 1921, chewing gum magnate William Wrigley Jr. became majority owner. In 1926, he renamed the park Wrigley Field and began transforming it into a true baseball cathedral. Bleachers, ivy, the hand-operated scoreboard, it all started here. Wrigley became a symbol of the Cubs' identity that is still going strong 100 years later. The Cubs returned to prominence in the 1920s. A new ace, Grover Cleveland Alexander, brought postseason pedigree. Despite battling alcoholism and epilepsy, the Cubs made another World Series in 1921, backed by a powerful offense. At the heart of it was Hack Wilson, a 5'6", 190-pound slugger with a violent swing and a volatile temper. In 1930, he put together a season for the ages, 56 home runs, and an MLB record 191 RBIs, a mark that still stands today. But in 1929, the Cubs collapsed in the World Series. After taking an 8-0 lead in Game 4, they blew it and lost the series to the Philadelphia A's in 5 games. Wilson burnt out fast as he was out of baseball by the mid-1930s and died broke in 1948. However, he would be elected to the Hall of Fame and will be remembered for his RBI record that's still going strong today. The Cubs made it back to the World Series in 1932, this time against the New York Yankees. Game 3 at Wrigley Field became legendary, with Cubs players heckling Babe Ruth and him allegedly pointing to center field before hitting a towering home run to that exact spot. Was it a called shot? No one knows for sure, but the moment became one of the most iconic in sports history. The Yankees swept the series. Another October, another Cubs disappointment. The Cubs stayed competitive. In 1935, they rode a 21-game win streak to a pennant, but lost to the Tigers in the World Series. In 1938, Gabby Hartnett hit the famed homer in the Gloman against Pittsburgh, a walk-off that sent them to yet another series, but the outcome was familiar. Swept by the Yankees, that made 4 World Series appearances in 10 years and 4 losses. By the end of the decade, the pattern had formed. The Cubs would win pennants, but when it mattered most, they couldn't finish the job. They had the history, the fans, the ballpark, but the heartbreak was becoming just as much a part of their story. After a strong season behind pitcher Hank Borowy, the Cubs faced the Detroit Tigers in the World Series. Up 2-1 in the series, they had a chance to take control in Game 4 at Wrigley Field. That's when Billy Cianis, owner of the Billy Goat Tavern, showed up with his pet goat Murphy. He had tickets for both of them, but stadium staff turned the goat away, claiming it smelled bad. Insulted, Cianis allegedly cursed the team on his way out. Them Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more. The Cubs lost the series. They wouldn't return to the World Series for 71 years. Whether it was coincidence, superstition, or fate, the curse stuck, becoming the defining symbol of Cubs futility. While other teams embraced modernization, the Cubs clung to tradition, most notably with day games. Owner Philip Wrigley refused to install lights at Wrigley Field, believing baseball was meant to be played under the sun. Gave the park charm, but it came at a cost. The Cubs missed out on national exposure and lost flexibility in scheduling. Wrigley became baseball's time capsule, but the team inside it started to feel like a relic too. The 1950s were forgettable for Cubs fans. No playoff appearances, frequent last place finishes, declining attendance, but then came Ernie Banks. Signed in 1953, Banks became the face of the franchise. He hit 512 home runs, won back-to-back NL MVPs in 58 and 59, and became known simply as Mr. Cub. His quote, "Let's play two," made him beloved even when the team was dreadful. He never played in the postseason, he never complained, and Banks became the embodiment of Cubs fandom. Endlessly loyal, heartbreak-proof, and hopeful to the end. The 1960s weren't much better, but by 1969, everything changed. The Cubs had Ferguson Jenkins, Cy Young caliber ace, Ron Santo, their great third baseman, and Billy Williams, and a 38-year-old Ernie Banks still hanging on. Under fiery manager Leo DeRocher, the Cubs were in first place by 9 games in mid-August. The new NL East division was theirs to lose, and they did. The Cubs went into a brutal September skid, while the New York Mets, long considered a joke, caught fire. During a crucial series at Shea Stadium, a black cat wandered in front of the Cubs dugout. It was a surreal, on-the-nose omen. They lost 17 of their final 25 games, and the Mets won the division, then the World Series. It was more than a collapse. It felt like the Cubs were truly cursed. The GOAT, the cat, and worst of all, the Mets. By the end of the 60s, the Cubs hadn't won a pennant in 30 years. They had the stars, they had the moments, but when pressure mounted, something always gave way. The heartbreak was no longer surprising, it was expected. After the collapse of 1969, the Cubs spent most of the 1970s fading into irrelevance. The core stars aged, the farm system dried up, and by the mid-70s, they were back near the bottom of the standings. Wrigley Field remained charming, but the product on the field didn't match. Still, the Cubs held onto their identity, one steeped in tradition, daytime baseball, and fiercely loyal fans who kept coming back win or lose. And then came a voice that became iconic in Chicago. In 1982, the Cubs hired Caray away from the White Sox. Known for his thick glasses, slurred enthusiasm, and unfiltered charm, Caray became a legendary voice. Every 7th inning, he led Wrigley in singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." Every home run was punctuated with "Holy cow," and thanks to WGN's national cable reach, Cubs games were broadcast across the country. Kids in places like Florida and Nevada were growing up Cubs fans not because of the winning, but because of all this. Caray made Wrigley feel like a home for millions who'd never stepped foot in it. Also in 1982, the Cubs made a trade with the Phillies for veteran shortstop Larry Bowa and a little-known infielder known as Ryne Sandberg. That throw-in became a franchise legend. By 1984, Sandberg had blossomed into a star. He could hit for power, steal bases, and played elite defense at second base. That June, he had a breakout performance on national TV. 2 late home runs off Bruce Sutter to tie the Cardinals twice in a game the Cubs eventually won. He won NL MVP that season and became the face of the franchise for the next decade. He recently passed away, but not before being not only a Cubs legend, but a baseball legend. The Cubs rode Sandberg, Rich Sutcliffe, who went 16-1 after a midseason trade, and a well-rounded lineup to an NL East title. It was their first postseason appearance in a very long time, since 1945. They dominated the Padres in the first 2 games of the NLCS. All they needed was 1 win in San Diego. In Game 5, they led 3-2 in the 7th, then a routine grounder went through first baseman Leon Durham's legs, and San Diego scored 4 runs, took the lead, and won the pennant. The ghost had returned. The Cubs reloaded around a new core in 1989, Mark Grace, Andre Dawson, and a young ace named Greg Maddux. They won the division again, but were outplayed by Will Clark and the San Francisco Giants in the NLCS. Cubs fans had seen this before. Hope, then heartbreak. By the end of the 1980s, they'd become a national brand. Everyone knew Wrigley, Sandberg, and Harry Caray, but they still hadn't reached a World Series since 1945. The 1990s began with more of the same. Losing records, bad contracts, and a revolving door of managers. Greg Maddux, the team's ace of the future, was allowed to walk in free agency after winning the 1992 Cy Young, which he repeated 3 more times for the Braves. But just when things seemed darkest, a new star emerged, one that would light up Wrigley like never before. In 1998, Sammy Sosa transformed from a streaky power hitter into a larger-than-life icon. That summer, he and Mark McGwire went head-to-head chasing Roger Maris's home run record of 61. Sosa hit 20 home runs in June alone, which is still a record. Wrigley was rocking every night, the media couldn't get enough. He finished the year with 66 home runs, won NL MVP, and more importantly, brought the Cubs back to the postseason. They lost quickly in the NLDS to Atlanta, but things finally seemed to be up. Sosa had reignited the city, and he hit 60-plus home runs 3 times in 98, 99, and 2001, something no one else had done. His signature hop, the finger kisses, the boombox in the locker room, he was a phenomenon. But the glow didn't last. By the early 2000s, the Cubs had rebuilt around young power arms Kerry Wood, who struck out 20 batters in a game as a rookie in 1998, and Mark Pryor, a can't-miss prospect with electric stuff. In 2003, they had a dominant rotation, solid bats in Moises Alou, Aramis Ramirez, and a still powerful Sosa, and looked ready to make a real October run. They beat the Braves in the NLDS, their first postseason series win since 1908, and then came the NLCS against the Florida Marlins. The Cubs led the series 3-2, Game 6 at Wrigley Field with Mark Pryor on the mound. They led 3-0 in the 8th inning, just 5 outs away from their first World Series since 1945. Then came the moment. Luis Castillo hit a foul ball down the left field line. Moises Alou raced over to make the catch near the wall when a fan named Steve Bartman reached out and deflected the ball. Alou slammed his glove in frustration. The crowd turned, the air shifted. What followed was a total meltdown. Pryor unraveled. Alex Gonzalez, a normally sure-handed fielder, botched a double play ball. The Marlins scored 8 runs in that inning, and the game was over. Momentum was gone, and the hopes seemed to be shattered. The Cubs lost Game 7 too, and just like that, the dream died. Bartman became a scapegoat, facing harassment, media stalking, even death threats, but the loss was not on one fan. It was a total team collapse. Years later, the Cubs organization would apologize and even give Bartman a 2016 World Series ring. But in the moment, 2003 became another chapter in the Cubs' curse-filled saga. By the early 2000s, the Cubs were close. They had the pitching, they had the bats, but something always slipped. After 2003, the Cubs still had their money and a massive fan base, but instead of breaking through, the next decade brought more heartbreak and eventually a full teardown. The Cubs came into 2004 with sky-high expectations. Their pitching staff was still anchored by Mark Pryor, Kerry Wood, and newly acquired Greg Maddux returning for a second stint. But the season unraveled late. Fueled by injuries, poor chemistry, and clubhouse tension, they missed the playoffs again. Injuries piled up. Pryor and Wood, once most promising arms in baseball, never regained form. By 2006, the Cubs were back at the bottom. But with Lou Piniella as manager and an influx of free agents like Alfonso Soriano, the Cubs built a veteran-heavy team that won back-to-back division titles in 07 and 08. But first, they were swept by the Diamondbacks, and then the next year, best record in the NL, they were swept again, this time by the Dodgers. 2 dominant regular seasons and 0 playoff wins. It felt like the curse was back in full force and the expensive roster was aging fast. By 2009, it was clear the competitive window had closed. The Cubs slumped back into mediocrity. The Tribune Company, longtime owners of the franchise, sold the team to the Ricketts family in 2009 for nearly $900 million. The Ricketts wanted more than a winning season, they wanted a sustainable championship culture. So in 2009, they hired the man who built the Red Sox team that broke their curse, Theo Epstein. They didn't try to patch up the Cub, he tore them down. Veterans were traded for prospects, payroll was slashed, Wrigley Field renovations began, and the team was awful on purpose. But beneath the surface, a foundation was forming. They drafted Kris Bryant, traded for Anthony Rizzo, signed Jorge Soler and Wilson Contreras. They took a chance on Jake Arrieta, a struggling pitcher from Baltimore. They developed Javier Baez and Kyle Hendricks. By 2014, the team still lost 89 games, but the pieces were in place. And then, one of the final missing ones arrived. Epstein hired Joe Maddon, an unorthodox manager who preached confidence and freedom. The Cubs called up prospect Kris Bryant in April, and suddenly everything clicked. Arrieta had an elite second half, finishing with a 1.77 ERA and winning the Cy Young. Bryant hit 26 home runs and won Rookie of the Year. The Cubs won 97 games, which was good enough for a wildcard spot. Then, in the wildcard game, Arrieta shut out the Pirates, striking out 11. Then in the NLDS, the Cubs beat the Cardinals, their longtime rivals, in 4 games, and the core had officially arrived. They were swept by the Mets in the NLCS, and the prediction made by Back to the Future in '85 that the Cubs would win in 2015 did not end up happening, but it wasn't too far off either. The Cubs had youth, power, pitching, and leadership. They were ahead of schedule, and for the first time in a century, the words "next year" didn't feel like a joke to Cubs fans. By the start of the 2016 season, everything was in place. The Cubs had a young, explosive core of Kris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, Javier Baez, Addison Russell, Kyle Schwarber. They had a veteran bench with players like Ben Zobrist, Dexter Fowler, and David Ross. Shutdown rotation in John Lester, Jake Arrieta, Kyle Hendricks, and the newly signed John Lackey. And most importantly, a manager who kept them loose, Joe Maddon. They weren't just built to contend, they were built to win it all. From day one, the 2016 Cubs played like a team on a mission. They opened the season 25-6, and by the All-Star break, they were in first place and never gave it up. Kris Bryant hit .292 with 39 homers and 1 NL MVP. Kyle Hendricks led the league with a 2.13 ERA. The Cubs won 103 games, which was the most in MLB that year and their most since 1910. Everything seemed to be lining up. Still, fans were wary. They'd been burned before and didn't want to get their hopes up. In the NLDS, the Cubs faced Madison Bumgarner and the San Francisco Giants, a team with a knack for even-year magic. The Cubs took the first 2 games but dropped Game 3 in extras. Game 4 seemed headed for a Game 5 until the 9th inning when the Cubs erupted for 4 runs, shocking the Giants and avoiding a Game 5. It felt like a turning point, the kind of comeback cursed teams don't pull off. The Cubs met the Dodgers in the NLCS. After falling behind 2-1 in the series, they stormed back. 10-2 win in Game 4, John Lester shoving in Game 5, and Game 6, Kyle Hendricks was brilliant and Aroldis Chapman slammed the door. The Cubs won the pennant, and for the first time since 1945, the Cubs were going to the World Series. The weight of generations lifted, but the job wasn't done yet. The Cleveland Indians, riding a dominant bullpen and hot bats, took a 3-1 series lead. Cubs fans across the world felt that familiar nausea. The Indians were and still are a team that has a World Series drought of their own, not winning at this point in nearly 70 years, and in 2025 nearly 80 years, but the Cubs fought back. Game 5 at Wrigley, Cubs win 3-2, barely hanging on. Game 6 in Cleveland, Cubs explode for 9 runs, Addison Russell hits a grand slam, and the series is tied. Game 7 was everything. Hope, fear, heartbreak, glory condensed into 9 innings, and then some. The Cubs jumped ahead 5-1 early, but the Indians clawed back. Bottom of the 8th, 2 outs, Chapman on the mound. Rajai Davis, of all people, hit a shocking 2-run home run, and it was a tie game at 6-6. A 17-minute pause in the most important moment in franchise history. In that time, Jason Hayward gathered the team in the weight room and gave a passionate speech. In the top of the 10th, Ben Zobrist doubled, Montero singled, and the Cubs led 8-6. In the bottom of the 10th, 1 run scored and there were 2 outs. Michael Martinez grounded the third, Kris Bryant fielded it with a smile, threw it to Rizzo, and the Cubs had won the World Series. After 108 years, the curse was over. 5 million people flooded the streets of Chicago. It became the 7th largest gathering in human history. Grandparents cried, strangers hugged, and the weight of generations melted in joy. This wasn't just a championship, it was the weight of 100 years finally off the shoulders of the Cubs organization. Ernie Banks, Ron Santo, Harry Caray, all of them were smiling somewhere. When the Cubs won the World Series in 2016, it felt like the start of a dynasty. They were young, talented, and fearless. Theo Epstein had built a juggernaut, and most of the core was locked in for years. The city believed, the league feared them, but that parade, it wasn't the start of something, it was the peak. They'd make the playoffs the next 2 years, but wouldn't make it past the NLCS. In 2019, they faltered and missed the playoffs entirely. After the season, the Cubs let Joe Maddon walk, and it seemed like the team's window was finally closed. What followed wasn't a blow-up at first, it was a slow, painful unraveling. 2016 hero Kyle Schwarber was non-tendered in 2020 and has since went on to be one of the best power hitters in baseball and is arguably having his best year ever in 2025. Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, and Javier Baez, once the Golden Core, were all traded at the 2021 trade deadline, although this seemed to be the right move as these players are heavily regressed or out of the league. Theo Epstein stepped down after 2020 and Judd Hoyer took over and began reimagining the future. The dynasty never came, the core brought one title, and though that was everything, fans were asking what could have been. The Cubs began building again, not from scratch but with a plan. They signed Seiya Suzuki from Japan, a disciplined, powerful outfielder. Signed Dansby Swanson, a slick fielding shortstop and World Series winner. Developed young talent like Justin Steele, Christopher Morel, and Jordan Wicks. They also fleeced the Mets in a trade for Pete Crow Armstrong, who got off to a slow start to his career, but in 2025 he's went off. In 2023 they hovered in the wildcard race for months, but collapsed in September and missed the playoffs by a game. After a rather eventful 2024, the Cubs were the best team in baseball for a lot of the 2025 season, but at the time of writing this are well behind the Brewers. However, they have a great offense led by Michael Busch, PCA, and offseason acquisition Kyle Tucker. The future is uncertain for the Cubs, but things finally seem to be up for them after 80 years of disappointment. And that's the brief history of the Cubs. I know this video wasn't that brief, but I want to try to condense the most important parts of the Cubs history into a digestible video. Like I said earlier, I'm going to try to cover all 30 MLB teams in the series, so let me know what team you want to see next. If you enjoyed this, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe as it really helps me out. And thank you for watching Baseball Domain.